dobry Państwu. Mamy wyjątkowego gościa dzisiaj, ale pozwolę sobie zacząć po polsku, dlatego że doskonale wiem, że Geoff zna nasz język bardzo dobrze i wszystko to świetnie rozumie. Poznaliśmy się kilka lat temu na jednej z konferencji organizowanych przez IIF w Wiedniu. Rozpoczęliśmy dyskusję o polskiej gospodarce w trakcie przerwy lunchowej i ta dyskusja trwała kolejne 2 panele. Geoff zawsze wykazywał się niezwykłą wnikliwością, jeśli chodzi o funkcjonowanie polskiej gospodarki, ale ma też znakomite, szerokie spojrzenie. Zajmował się gospodarkami rozwiniętymi, amerykańską gospodarką, także dużymi gospodarkami wschodzącymi, między innymi Chinami, więc myślę, że da nam bardzo dobre spojrzenie z zewnątrz na perspektywy Europy, a w szczególności polskiej gospodarki. Zazwyczaj rozmawialiśmy w ten sposób, że to Geoff zadawał mi pytania, także w trakcie misji Międzynarodowego Funduszu Walutowego regularnych w Warszawie. Dzisiaj nasze role się odwracają, jestem w dużo bardziej komfortowej sytuacji, to ja będę pytał Geoffa. Now I will switch to English to make our guest more comfortable, and I will start with a question about main conclusions from a conference organized by the IMF and the Croatian Central Bank in Dubrovnik in late May. We met there last time, and the theme of the conference was growth and resilience in the CEE region in a more fragmented world. What, in your view, what were the main conclusions from this conference? It was mostly about how policymakers in our region can preserve resilience of macroeconomic frameworks to future shocks related to factors like geopolitical tensions, fragmenting global trade, or climate-related issues. What are, in your view, key takeaways from this conference?
Thank you, Piotr. It's very good to be here. In general, conversations about the growth situation in Europe are difficult to map onto what's happening in Poland because the situation here is so much better. There was a big discussion about why the Draghi report did not focus more on Poland or consult Poland, and the core reason, obviously, is that growth is so much better here. Per capita income is up more than 20% since 2019 compared to 0 in the Czech Republic. And it's not just that the top-line growth numbers are good, it's that the composition of growth in Poland is very strong. It's driven by productivity, not other sources like investments yet that are less sustainable over time. So I think that's the first point. But I think the second thing is that the issues that were raised in the conference are worth discussing in the context of Poland, and I would highlight 3. The first is on labor markets. One of the core strengths of Poland over the last 15 years has been the affordability of labor, that wages have not grown faster than productivity. If you look at the real exchange rate based on the unit labor cost since 2012, it was effectively flat. So amid very rapid growth in productivity, you had wages stay in line with that rather than outpace, which maintained Poland's competitiveness. That has suddenly changed. The real exchange rate has appreciated significantly. So Poland has lost competitiveness in euro terms. I think that's the first one. The second issue is on the demographic issue. If you looked in 2012, you would have expected a sharp fall in the working population in Poland, but that was offset by higher labor force participation and higher immigration. Now the current environment is still negative on the demographics, but now there's much more antagonism towards immigration. So if you're going to have a smaller workforce, you need to do more with the workforce that you have. And there, the 2 areas where Poland really sticks out are on training and digital skills. So there needs to be a narrative around how those gaps are being addressed. So I think the labor market was one big area of focus. The second area I would mention from that conference is on scaling up export markets. The biggest difference I see between policymakers and national governments is that the policymakers at the European level or at the IMF were focused very much on this issue of completing the single market and giving exporting firms in Poland larger markets to tap into. So what are the core areas in which the single market is not complete for Poland? We often mention trucking and services, but I think there needs to be a bigger narrative around where the single market is not working for Poland. And then the third one is innovation. So even though Poland's productivity growth is very high at the current income level, there likely needs to be much more R&D in order to kind of complete the convergence from 60% of the US to 80% of the US, which is the next goal. When Korea had the same per capita income as Poland, R&D spending was 4% of GDP. In Poland, it's 1.5%. So those are the three areas that were mentioned in this conference, and they're not yet binding in a big way for Poland, but they will be over the next decade.
Okay. Now let's be more specific about Poland. Poland is widely seen as the fastest growing EU economy over the next few years, not only this year. But what are the biggest risks to this scenario, in your view? And what to do, what should be done already now to sustain such a relatively strong pace of growth in Poland in the longer horizon? What are policy priorities in your view?
Well, I think in the near term, there needs to be a switch in the policy mix. Right now, fiscal policy is too loose, and maybe we'll come back to the fiscal issue. Fiscal is too loose. Monetary is still tight for good reasons, because the disinflation process is not complete, but it's almost there. So the hope going forward in this next 1 to 2 year period would be that wage pressures moderate, which enables, at the same time that fiscal tightens, which enables monetary policy to ease back towards neutral, which would allow credit to complete. But I think that the longer term objectives get back to this question of investment and innovation that I was referring to before, as well as having a narrative for what is going to happen on the labor force. I think that if you look at this digital skills and training problem, there is a real concern about the productivity growth going forward.
Okay, but the IMF says in your recent report on Poland published in January that over the next 2-3 years until 2027, basically Poland will be still outperforming other EU economies, but later on it will possibly underperform or likely underperform others. What in particular should be done to avoid such a scenario that Poland will not be outperforming others anymore?
Well, again, one of the other concerns that we have is that the model of growth in Poland has been that it's been export-led, which is that of all the value added created in Poland, more is sold abroad than sold domestically. That is going to be a difficult model to continue because global growth, the IMF has the lowest global growth forecast that we've had in 35 years. So in an environment of weak global growth, it's difficult to rely on external demand. And with the real exchange rate appreciating, that's going to be more difficult. But it comes back to the labor and capital situation that I mentioned before. I don't see an alternative.
And earlier you mentioned deepening of European integration. That was one of key conclusions from the conference in Dubrovnik, and I think that would be crucial for Poland because Poland's export-led growth model relied more than in case of any other CE economy on exports to the EU, not outside the EU. So dismantling the existing barriers for intra-EU trade would most likely bring the biggest benefits for the Polish economy.
Yeah, and I just find that there's a gap. At the level of Brussels and Draghi, there's a broad agreement that this is a priority. But then, and then if you talk to a company, they can mention several different micro things that they are facing. But it's very difficult in order to break through from a policy standpoint. You need something in between. What's the broad change that needs to happen? And it seems like these happen via barter in some ways. That Poland can identify a problem in Spain, but Spain is reluctant to unilaterally reduce this issue. So what I'm seeing is there's broad agreement that this needs to happen, but very little progress in getting it done.
Okay, let's talk about the strained fiscal position in Poland. actually not only in Poland, but also here. The Polish fiscal policy has responded quite effectively to the shocks of the past few years, but it left the legacy of elevated public debt, wide fiscal deficit. We are under pressure of very large military and climate-related spending, especially military-related in Poland. And what should be priorities farther out? Whether we should focus in fiscal policy on supporting growth or rebuilding buffers, fiscal space for the future, for navigating among different future shocks.
Yeah, when I first arrived in Poland, I was constantly asked about the fiscal crisis that was going to happen. And I found this very strange because deficits were around 3, debt was around 50. This was just not a worrisome situation. Since then, things have changed. I mean, deficits around 6, debt is rising very rapidly. We're in a much higher interest rate environment. And the main concern I have is the reason for the deficits. There's 2 good reasons to have a large deficit. One is a recession or a temporary shock. The second is if you're investing a lot that raises future growth. Neither of those are what is driving the current deficits. Spending is up 9 percentage points of GDP since 2019, of which 1 is defense. It is not driven by defense or climate. There may be good reasons for a lot of the increases in spending, but the current deficits are not sustainable. So there is going to have to be a discussion about rationalizing spending and finding additional revenue. Something has to give. And the fact that there is more softness on fiscal policy in the rest of Europe, getting more flexibility from Brussels is not a reason to keep the deficit higher.
Okay, but your point is that we shouldn't be very much concerned about Poland's fiscal position. I guess that mostly thanks to relatively low level of public debt at the starting point.
No, I would say one should start to be concerned. Not that there is a fiscal crisis looming immediately. The problem is, it is true that good fiscal policy over the past has left Poland in a good starting point. But if this is continued at this point, that good space will disappear and Poland will not be in a position to respond to future shocks. And these issues that are looming in the distance, like climate and like aging, have not even really shown up in the fiscal yet. So something does need to give.
Yeah, you are very much right. One of the future shocks for Poland, especially for public finances, that is often missed by many observers, is the explosion of healthcare system costs related to rapid aging of the Polish society. So probably in the next decade, Poland's public finances will be under pressure of both military and climate-related spending and explosively rising costs of the healthcare system. So fiscal policy will not be able to support growth as much as in the past or now. Also, the inflow of EU funds will be way smaller in net terms, definitely. Poland has been quickly developing, so we will not be a major beneficiary of EU funds anymore. So 2 important engines of growth for Poland, both EU funds and expansionary fiscal policy, will be out. So what could play a role of the major engine of growth and funding growth in the Polish economy? I guess the financial system. But we have shrinking banking sector. What could be done to reverse it and to make banks much more important engine of economic growth in Poland? And how can we develop the capital market to also become more important engine of economic growth in Poland?
Yeah, so first on banks, I think the big change relative to 15 years ago is that the banking system, as well as the external and the balance of payments, are just so much more stable. Capital ratios are almost twice as high. Liquidity ratios are enormous. I spend 0 time worrying about the stability of the financial system, particularly in terms of banks. I think right now I don't worry so much about crowding out from the fiscal deficits, but the fiscal deficits probably do push interest rates higher, which makes the cost of credit higher, which makes the demand for credit lower. So I do worry about that somewhat. Maybe I start to worry that we've erred too much on the stability side, and whether there may be pressure that limits banks' ability to grow credit going forward based on capital ratios. But in general, the strength of the stability side removes a huge concern. I think the capital markets side is the area where there's enormous room for growth. But I think it matters a lot how we frame the question. Is the goal to have the biggest Warsaw Stock Exchange as possible, or is the goal to have a low cost of capital for firms and a good return on assets for households? I would lean towards the latter and focusing particularly on the households. And maybe I would have three things in mind, and these may not be entirely popular. I think the first is, it's unclear, given how much Polish households are invested in real estate, why we should have real estate subsidized in Poland. Both on the tax side, in terms of the capital gains, and less tax on the property tax side, particularly on multiple properties. Real estate is it's obviously been a good return thus far, but it is a large and illiquid asset. So I think the first is looking at why real estate is so subsidized. The second is I would push very hard for the third pillar pension fund system. The best way for households, for most households, to get access to financial assets is via long-term investing for retirement. That is where they should enter that, nothing on the short-term side. And the third is I would look at the products that are available to households. The obvious one is low cost and diversified, but for me it would be internationally diversified products. That would be the logical way that households would get involved. If the goal was simply the stock exchange, if you look at Asia, it basically was achieved via a combination of privatizing state assets on the stock exchange combined with a repression of household savings which forced it into the domestic capital market. But that doesn't seem like the most efficient way to go. I think focusing on diversifying and keeping liquid household assets is the priority.
Okay. Our time is running out, so I think we will stop here. I thank you very much for sharing your views and for these recommendations for development of the Polish capital market. And I ask the audience to join me in expressing gratitude to Geoff, because he's leaving just in a few days. He's leaving position of a senior representative of IMF in our region, and he's taking on a new role at the IMF in Washington. So thank you, Geoff, for all the discussions about the Polish economy. Also, once one of playgrounds in Warsaw when our kids accidentally met. Thank you for all of that, and see you in the future, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.